Whenever you're ready. And then more people should trickle in 5 to 10 minutes.
Sure. Isabel, quickly, I think something is wrong with your audio. We're having trouble like hearing you. It's like warped. But that should be fine. Hello everyone. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Fareed, and Isabel and I are hosting this event as reps of the Undergraduate Environmental Union at Duke. Currently, we're a subset of the Duke student government, and our mission is to promote collaboration and create a network between the environmental institutions on campus and beyond. Today, we are so honored to welcome John Paul Jose, who was born in Kerala, India, and in 2018, John set out to discover really what steps Indian politicians were taking to address the climate crisis as one of the Fridays for Future youth leaders in India. And now at the age of 24, he's still a passionate climate activist, criticizing climate action and addressing how global warming affects India's forests and ecosystems. So today he will be giving a presentation on environmental justice in India. We want to thank John for offering his time today. And without further ado, he can take it away as soon as I start screen sharing his presentation. So give me a sec and we'll be on our way. Can you all see that presentation? And ready when you are, John.
Okay, can I start? Can I start now? Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you. Sorry, John. Start whenever you're ready, and then just let me know when you want me to flip the slides.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Fareed and Isabel, for hosting me here, and thanks to Duke as well. And I think we are far ahead of time, so we'll quickly start with the presentation. So I will be talking about environmental and climate justice in India. And so just to have an idea, when we look at the global context, we always have that Western model or Occidental model where we have something like the journey of environmental justice. So in the next slide, we see so when we talk about environmental justice, it's always revolving around fairness, equity, and inclusiveness. So justice, everyone should get the justice, and it should be based on equity, and everyone should have a say in getting the justice. No one can decide that is just for someone and other thing is not just for someone. So everyone should get that justice. So when we look back how the kind of justice related to environment developed in Western concept, there was already kind of a discrimination that began since colonialism, the kind of imperial nature, and there was a race comes as a major factor, and it flowed into industrialization where the kind of financial or economic, including labor, everywhere we had that kind of discrimination. At the same time, there was also that kind of environmental degradation. So that's why we call environmental justice is also social justice. So when those kind of development trajectory and the kind of progress that the system, I think then people began to be conscious, because that's how the NIMBY idea, not in my backyard, because those things should not happen in my backyard. So people began to realize it's important to take care of our community space. So those environmental justice became a civil rights movement, because if there is no environmental justice, then follows social injustice as well. So when we move forward, next slide. So when we move to India, it's we know it's a very complex and very diverse country. So we already had that social injustice prevailing very much in the society. and it transformation of nature was something happening at very minute scale. And with the advent of colonialism, the kind of social justice began to be, social injustice began to assist the environmental injustice, because colonialism had a major drawback on India based on the resource exploitation. Like people were exploited based on their race, identity, their location, then all the natural resources for like minerals, then timber, then the resources produced by farmers, everything was kind of exploited. So through this process, there was like frequent discrimination, because like when we produce something or when we live somewhere, we have like power concentrated on someone else. Because when we live in one environment, then the people from some other environment is taking control of our life. So everything related to our lifestyle, everything that flows from the environment which we live in. So we have a social system, a tradition, culture in the way in which we interact with the environment we live in. When the outsider comes in, it's getting disrupted. Then something is being imposed. Thus begin the social injustice, then environmental injustice. Then with the process of urbanization, then development, industrialization, resource exploitation, and capitalism, the kind of trajectory began to follow the kind of Western model. So when we look into employment, when we look into development, any project comes in, people are getting displaced. So like when someone is living in a rural area, then they are getting displaced to some other area. The rural area is like industrialized or urbanized. Then the upper middle class or rich people live there, and they sometimes call themselves like most affluent sections of the society. And on the other side, the other people, they are just outcasted, and they have no financial security, no social security, and they have been completely torn away from the progress which they have been advancing with the traditional culture and kind of lifestyle they have been following in that environment. So for example, like if someone from rural India, like suppose Delhi was very rural long ago. So if we say like Delhi gets developed, urbanized, industrialized, those who are not affluent, they get outcasted and they have to live in the outskirts. At the meantime, other areas get developed into rich places, posh avenues, streets, and those areas have all access to all resources. There's no water scarcity, there is good housing, and at the same time, people who were actually residing there with everything they had, it's getting lost. They are transformed to the newly created environment that's outskirts, where they have to just live the life they are being forced to without access to fresh water, and just seeing all the discharge, like waste, everything getting accumulated there. And the kind of environmental injustice is getting strong with the climate crisis, because so there are people are living already in a degraded situation, and at the same time, issue like climate crisis, increasing heat, it's affecting them, then changing climatic patterns, and then weather events like flooding, extreme rainfall, those things are like frequently getting affected, people living in the outskirts and people living a very miserable life. So people who are affluent, they have always like someone to call at their hand, or there is alternatives to take safety, but the other people, they have nothing else. So there is grave injustice follows, and there is complete environmental degradation. So even in the newly created environment, there's a degradation of lifestyles that they have to follow. Next slide. So when we look into the historic movement, all the environment injustice is associated with some kind of development activity. It's nothing like a neighbor fighting with another neighbor. So that's not the kind of environmental injustice. Environmental injustice is associated with development, capitalism, and industrializations. So one of the first recorded like environment movement or injustice we have in India is like the Bushnell Movement. the community people dependent on this livelihood forest, it was succumbed to logging for a construction of a new palace, and the people opposed it. So that's how, because someone living in that particular environment, that environment is everything for them, because they derive their livelihood and security, everything from that place. When that is being disrupted, they have no way to live forward unless you provide something or anything. Again, the Chipko movement, almost recent, in 1973, again related to logging. People are dependent on the forest for livelihood. If the forest is gone, they are just pushed to grave injustice because there is no way to move forward. Then again, silent valley protest, it's again a livelihood forest and also a rich biodiversity hotspot. So here again, it's threatening nature as well as people. Then one of the biggest protests that we have seen in India, where even a lot of international attention which we got, was Narmada Bachao Andolan, like very series of dams proposed at the Narmada River, which actually leads to flooding of many major ecosystems and also a lot of villages and displacing thousands of people. The protests which began just because of the environmental injustice, because when the project was coming in, there was grave injustice because people were actually displaced to some other locations and they were not properly rehabilitated and they were succumbed to live a life which they have no hope. So at the same time, when the movement actually began, it had to incorporate the kind of environmental threat as well, because such a large scale dam, it was affecting the biodiversity, nature, along with the people living there. So that was like one of the biggest crises we were facing during that time. Yeah, next slide. So as of now, the major area of concern due to environmental kind of destructive development is like land use change or diversion. So like I said, we depend on certain environment for our living. So mining or industries, commercial plantation, road expansion, hydroelectric projects or urbanizations. So those things are like very linear and they are even continuously emerging as like major definition of progress, like human development. So those things are like, so when it comes to mining or hydroelectric projects, those things are mainly affecting the forest communities, like most disadvantaged indigenous communities, because they are not considered as part of forest. So we know, like we have the certain ideology, like forest means very wild, but we never consider humans as part of forest. Even though there are people living sustainable lifestyle, we kind of disconsider them as part of forest. So they are not considered part of forest and they are being uprooted to a new world, a new environment, because that's very different from the livelihood they have been following for thousands of years. And again, other kind of development activities. So those kind of people, like if it's dependent on forest or agriculture, those things are getting disrupted through this development. So rural and forest communities get disrupted. And there's a huge ecological and ecosystem loss and ineffective displacement and distribution. Because many times, just for political reasons, they just displace and rehabilitate some people and others are left out. So they have to live in somewhere like slums or just kind of a congested area with minimum basic facilities. Then their livelihood is disrupted and they have no hope to move forward unless there is a support or we revert back to their lifestyle. Then contamination of food sources, because when some project comes in, even if it's in the outskirts of their livelihood, the kind of industrial effluence, everything is going to affect people. Then air and water pollution. It's a major problem across the globe because nowadays we have like set a limit of effluence that industries can emit. So actually there is a like license to emit by a certain level. So even at that level, we are seeing like massive air and water pollution. So it comes from industrial effluence, public discharge, contained accumulation, and core versus outskirts. So as I was saying, like we always try to keep our core cities very clean, because that's some like a lot of business activities or tourism or kind of presentation that which we need for aesthetic reasons. But outskirts, the people who are poor living there, and that area we never consider as like safe. So when there is air pollution, people who are in the core areas, who are rich, they can afford air purifier, they could afford mask, multiple other facilities, but people living in outskirts, they cannot afford or air purifier. And mask, they cannot change mask every time. Even if they could afford a mask, it's very difficult for them to change it again and again. Then that's the unequal access to fresh water and air, because all those houses have those connected spaces of like access to basic amenities, electricity or water or air. It's all available for them. Then one of the major neglected area, even if when we say about adaptation to climate crisis as well as agriculture, there's already industrial monocrop and mechanization, globalization, then corporate ization and GM and chemical fertilizer, that farmers are forced to abandon their kind of traditional agriculture activity because they were not getting fair price with the involvement of corporates, and they were not getting fair amount of financial security due to neglect and promotion of kind of industrial agriculture. So when there are like 10 small scale farmers, they produce for themselves and for others. And when there is like one MNC producing some good, some agriculture produce in thousands of hectares, they're producing for someone because they're aiming for profit. But on the other scale, a small scale farmer, he is aiming for livelihood. So that's very different, because when we always favor for economic activity, there is very much injustice. So everything is related to environment, the land or nature. So every social injustice that we see is always connected to environment. But when we think about like any movement or history, we never see kind of like large scale climate movement or environment movement in India, because we are not educating or making aware of the kind of relation that social justice is equal to environmental justice. We are not building that connection. So those traditional livelihood and knowledge is lost when the small scale farmers are replaced with industrial monocrop. Then they are just forced to join the invisible market to trade or do what they are not aware of, and their insecurities continue. Yeah, next slide. So another major area of concern is like India is the fifth most vulnerable country to climate change. The coast and islands. Next slide. You can just fast forward. Central and Peninsular India, the desert region, the Indo-Gangetic Plains, the Himalayan region. Yeah. So I just showed all those regions because that's the diversity of India. So there is a geographical diversity and there is multiple cultural diversity. So the environmental issue in the Himalayan region will be difficult than the coastal region. So the kind of environmental issue in the plateau area will be difficult when it comes to valleys, because there are diverse people and diverse cultural activity and kind of activity associated with the environment and nature. So when we look into those things, we will clearly see that there is, like when we kind of pursue on development activities, any of the region, it always connects to the nature and the people dependent on nature. So that becomes a vast majority of people living in India. And the most important thing, like being the third largest emitter of CO2, India should actually focus on the kind of environmental justice. Because even while presenting now, I'm kind of sweating because the temperature is like more than average even here now, because we have already crossed 1 degree Celsius with the temperature. So with rising temperature, the kind of heat and humidity is going to rise and again. And people who, like I said, who are on the outskirts, people who are not having that security to move forward, they are again left out. They are just they are just left out to face the injustice because they have no way to move forward because they are not getting much help or they cannot afford kind of adaptation techniques to live in 1.5 degrees Celsius or any kind of environmental degradation. Yeah, next slide. So these are the two recent justice movement happened in India, like in 2020. So one is the saving the Ingpat. So since a long time, the kind of development which we follow is like transformation of wildlife for mining or any infrastructural activities. So through this process, there's like huge loss, like I was saying, again, the livelihood process. So any kind of activity affecting the environment, it directly affects the people, the environment in which they are living in. So it's a great injustice that follows. This project was affecting the people. They were depending on that nature for their livelihood because the people living in one environment, for them, a forest or any kind of landscape doesn't make any difference. For them, for the environment in which they live, everything should be protected and it's part of their lifestyle and life. So you cannot say like there is a forest and it's not occupied by humans or anyone from that area, then it can be used for some other purpose. No, it can be done because that's also part of that environment. Like if the forest is lost, the birds are lost, and kind of ecosystems that are coming from there, the water flowing from there, the kind of temperature control that the forest functions, everything's getting lost. So this thing happened in a rural area. So because people say if the forest is lost in rural area, people just say like it's very much important because that's where all the wildlife is concentrated. But when it comes to the Save RA movement, then it's like the place where a forest came to survive rapidly developing city, the Mumbai city. So that's very ironic that a forest came to survive within the midst of growing urban jungle. So the forest was a place that people were dependent on, as well as the urban community were seeing the forest as something aesthetic and recreational value. So this is a major thing which, like in the modern context, the role of nature plays. Because for the people living in the forest, it's a function of livelihood, and the people in the city living around the forest is a like a social aspect. It's a place of recreation and aesthetic value, as well as a part of like in a polluted city, a source of fresh air. So there is like two people involved, like the new modern humans, as well as people who are still living the traditional lifestyle. So they both had to raise their voice because the forest has a very much social function as well as environmental function. At the both side, with urbanization and the kind of development that has followed, there was injustice. Yeah, next slide. So when we look into kind of activism, which we need to take in, so those things, when we have all those injustices, it doesn't come to like say like justice overnight, because we cannot expect justice from a system that is favoring injustice. So that's why in a democracy and all kind of these systems, we have like roles as citizens we could play. If you look back the history, all social movement had actually led to system reforms, change in power regimes, and kind of like waiving of a lot of discrimination and giving more rights to people. So democracy, as we know, like it has like more freedom to people, and there are a lot of fundamental rights reserved. So this is in context with the recent analysis of where India is now. So from democracy, India has transformed to electoral democracy, autocracy. that's very limited power for the people. And there is kind of a growing autocratic leadership. So if we are in a democracy, environmental and climate awareness is possible through the education which we get and to the role of people who are aware of the crisis. So when we know about something, when there is no action from the government, we could actually protest that lead to activism, and the massive activism which could disrupt the system and enable the leadership to act, that lead to sensible and effective leadership. So if there is a system or a leadership that could actually act on this injustice, then we could say the activism worked. Then if the activism replaces with a sensible and effective leadership, we could move forward for cooperation and collaboration to act on the crisis and lead to justice. This was something which India could have achieved if it was still a democracy, and it also applies to a lot of countries. So when it comes to current situation, that is electoral autocracy, all those rights are being suppressed. So we should be neutral. That is like, even if we are aware of environmental and climatic injustice or any social injustice, we should stay silent, or we should do something that is very much appreciative or very much in support of the government. So that comes greenwashing. If the government is doing something and that's again something like a socially acceptable way, or in a view it looks like a lookalike, then that is acceptable because we are also following that. And we cannot raise to activism, because if we act, then we are getting suppressed. Then comes the individual actions, because if I am acting individually, that doesn't matter, because it's not challenging the system or it's not demanding anything from the government. Then planting trees, that's not affecting anyone, that's not challenging the system, that is always allowing them to continue what they're doing. Cleaning up, they continue to create mess and we clean up. So that's again a kind of a safe road for them to continue. Then kind of justice that is being delivered is through backdoor policy. Some people and the leadership, they discuss together and they deliver the policy that they call as justice. Then they continue to move forward as business as usual. And that's the injustice we have. So that when we look into the kind of leaderships we have, we need that kind of rights to move forward. So like people in Hong Kong protesting because they needed change from that kind of suppressive leadership to more democratic one. Then at the same time, democratic countries are going back to what Hong Kong was before, or regions that had that kind of suppressive leadership. So those things should not follow, because having democracy is one of the biggest road to justice, and kind of suppressive democracy, injustice will follow, and it will take a lot of time for justice, because we need to lead social movement to reform the system and to change the leadership and restore democracy. So that's a long process. Yeah, next slide. So that's why we need to focus on global justice. So global justice means if there is injustice anywhere else, even other people also should get involved. So because it is just an internal matter. It's an international matter. Because when we say about some crisis happening in India or any other region, because we are living in a globalized world, so we should be connected. We cannot say like they are inferior or barbarians, or they are from the Orient, or they are well below the standards or ease of living which we have. So colonialism has always given all the privilege to some sections, and others are given to stay below the marginalized communities. So there should be a decolonization process. So it begins from the thoughts. So we should consider everyone as equal. So that's the first thought we should bring in. So the decolonizing our thoughts is the beginning. Then decolonizing our actions. It starts from resource exploitation and kind of racial inequality to anything. So all those things should be undo, because all those things should change, because if such things still exist, it is very difficult to follow with next actions. Then there are a lot of privileged people, especially those who are affluent, rich or living in developed countries, they should use the privilege to act upon to provide justice to people who are facing injustice. And there should be accountability for government from the both sides, from the people who are being served to injustice, and at the same time, people who are being able to do something to provide justice. And there should be global assistance through which affected people should be uplifted and safeguarded to a safe passage to future. Because when we uplift, the journey doesn't end there, because we have seen, like, even if we restore peace or serve justice, again, there is a chance to move forward or backward to injustice. So we should ensure that justice sustains, because if it's not sustained, then it's again move back to injustice. So that's where it ends, because we should safeguard all the matters of justice, because we should move forward with justice and considering the global community. Because so when we say like something is happening somewhere, we can't just turn our eyes or close it. We should open our eyes, see it. We should actually act upon it. So we have all those virtual platform to raise, or even public platform to raise. So we have seen with BLMs or even now anti-racial movement. So all those things flows from the environmental injustice, because the colonial mindset is something which gave the idea of racial inequality and all those things. So when we think about the kind of environment, then comes the diversity which we have in the world. So that comes from biodiversity and human diversity. So if we could accept both, then we could lead to global justice, whether it's environmental justice or social justice.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm sure everyone learned a lot, as I did. We can now move on to the Q&A portion of our presentation. If anyone has any questions, first of all, they want to unmute and ask. I know Colton asked a question in the chat, which I'll read off, but if anyone wants to ask any questions right away, don't be shy. Just unmute and ask away. Okay, well, in that case, sorry, I'm having a little trouble with Zoom.
There is a question in the chat box.
Yes.
Is my audio messed up?
Not quite. I don't know where my Zoom went. I can't see anything on my screen.
If my audio is not messed up, I can read off the questions in the chat.
Hey everyone. I'm Ashley. I can pop in real quick. Unfortunately, Isabel, I think on my end, your audio is still a little staticky, but I'm more than happy to read out the questions. Thank you for that awesome presentation, John. That was great. The first question in here is from Colton. It says, hi, John. Do you think that India will be able to balance its industrial and economic growth with its vulnerability and economic concerns? Especially since you've said India is deeply concerned with the environment.
So when we look back the traditional kind of development which India had, it got disrupted with colonialism. So we were kind of more traditional and more sustainable. If we look back the pre-colonial world, people were more concerned about environment, and people were living in more kind of joint families concerning their community and livelihood and the environment around them. So that was the kind of thing which we the kind of ancestors followed. But when we began to follow like that colonial mode, that's a rapid development, industrialization and urbanization, then began the only thing was like industrial and economic growth. So like it's not about balancing industrial and economic growth, but it's very much been a crucial and critical moment, because there is no compromise. we should be thinking about environment, because that should be a priority, because we are in a crisis, and if we don't think about environment, we are not going to come back, or there is no future. So then the environment can be the first priority, and economic and kind of development can be second and third priorities, because if we just focus on environment, then follows economic or kind of development progress as well. Because when we focus on only one side, economic progress, there's always one thing associated, that is profit maximization, and just to show the figures, like 10% growth or 5% growth. So that's what we aim for. So that's only just it's the involvement of money. So that's the kind of, on the other side, it's affecting the people on the other side. So when we doesn't think about people or environment, those vulnerabilities will follow. But when we kind of include people and the nature into the development, we could actually move forward with progress. So we have example of countries, like for example, Bhutan. Bhutan has something called green global happiness index, gross happiness index. They calculate the happiness of people rather than GDP. So they consider for social justice of people, and 80% of Bhutan is forest. And now they're trying to link the forest in India with Bhutanese forest. So that's the kind of actions they are doing, because they have more economic concern than what bigger countries like India or US could take in, because Bhutan is a landlocked country, and they could always depend on two giants on both the sides. At the same time, they are just taking care of everything and just moving forward. So then so it's possible to place environment at first, and also to come out of those vulnerabilities. Yeah.
Okay. The next question in the chat is from me, actually. I was wondering who you think is the most important to bring to the fight for environmental justice. Who do you think most needs to be persuaded to value the environment? Is it students? Is it government officials?
It can be students or people. And when it comes to students, like we are always in age of learning, and we have always like then peer groups and all those things. So we kind of learn something new, then we kind of get triggered to do something about it. So that's why students are leading climate movement or any movement. So even if we look back, all the social movement, even all those began with young people. So whether it's like the strikes, the pencil strike in Argentina, or the Turkish movement, or even the movements which we had some of it in India as well, all those things came from the young people, because we were learning something and we learned about the injustice. So even the people could everyone, even adults could take forward if they come to aware of it. So students just play a role to bring out there is injustice, and to act upon the justice is on the government officials, because students cannot deliver justice. We are just learning, or like we are just looking forward to the future. And so we just learned something, that is there is injustice. We point out there is injustice, and it's upon the government officials to deliver justice. Yeah.
All right, next question in the chat is from Maya. Could you speak on the farmers' protest and how it relates to environmental justice in India?
Can you repeat it?
Yes. The question is, can you speak at all on the farmers' protest and how it relates to environmental justice in India?
So farmers, although they're protesting, there are also like small scale farmers and large scale farmers involved in. So they have all the traditional way of producing, selling, and then also involvement in agriculture process. So that's getting disrupted with something, some other laws that favors more corporatization in the agriculture sector. So if I am producing something, I have the right to sell it somewhere and at a better price. But with the new law, it begins to corporatization and concrete contract farmings, because like at one time at the beginning, there is like a short price. Then later, actually they could abandon the farmers, because with the new law, there is like a lot of market for the farmers. So that's very much limited, because when the corporates just say like they are not going to take produce with the minimum support price, because with the kind of government establishment and local setup they have, farmers could actually sell their product at minimum price at assured senders. But with the new law, there is no guarantee there is a minimum price, and there is no guarantee there is a buyer. The buyer can be anyone, and there can't be any buyer as well. So most of the times the corporates, they demand much of the produce, and sometimes they much does not demand. So if just say like for next 5 years, they kind of assure that they are taking produce at minimum price or less than that, and they continue to take it. And after 5 years, they are saying that they're not going to take it. So in this 5 years, their assured market is lost, and their assured selling place is also lost. So it's very difficult to reestablish that places. So we cannot say like we cannot trust corporates and governments. So we doesn't know what they're up to, because they always look forward to money and power. So but when it comes to farmers, they look for livelihood. So because like if I come from agriculture family as well, because those our ancestors just work hard, then ensure that the future generation should not suffer. So they work hard, ensure there is land for us and there is a market. And so when it gets disrupted, it's very difficult to reestablish. So that's very important, because the environment in which we are dependent on, someone else is deciding how we should manage that environment. That's a great injustice, and also follows social injustice. Yeah.
The next question in the chat is from Isabel. You said that privileged people and rich countries need to lend a hand in the fight because this is a global issue. What specific actions can people take to help with this fight, even when they live very far away?
So when we look back, most of the rich countries, especially Europe, they have like very less forests. So they could actually rewild, they could actually fund. Also, when we say about like, even if they're individual, like the emissions that generated from those people in the rich countries, they're much more than when it comes to other regions. It's because of the consumption of the people. So that's why we have something called carbon footprint. So there might be only like 10 or 20% of people in the world, more than like 90% emissions comes from them. But it's because they also, when it comes to per capita, then even I become also a source for emissions, because even if I am not involved in like carbon emissions, the carbon footprint fall upon me. That's how the kind of per capita is calculated. So when we consume something, we should also actually look the source of the product. So how sustainability the product was made and where it was made. So we already know like a lot of products that comes from Asian or African countries, child labor is involved and kind of discrimination is involved. And also the products come from, comes from clean energy or fossil fuels. So that's also depend on our consumptions. So if we consume more of sustainable products, it's actually reducing the demand for unsustainably produced products. So that's one way to actually assist developing countries. Actually, we have that logic where developing countries, it will be difficult to have a fast transition because people are still in poverty. And if we just focus on like rapid transition, it will affect everyone, because even if those people are employed in fossil fuels, when if it's a contractor or line manager or even a digger, it's going to affect them badly if we completely shut down. So we should always have that transition in progress. But when it comes to rich countries, they have the fund to actually rehabilitate or just re-establish them in some other place, even if, and also like if that might be like 5 or 10% of the country. But when it comes to countries like India, there's like, we need to look for like more than 20-30% of the people in the country. So also with the green transitions, we could actually also save a lot of money we use for disaster management. So just look at in 2018, India lost like $37 billion for due to climate crisis. So if we could have averted that crisis, those $37 billion would have been used for resilience or adaptation or mitigation. But still, it's very difficult with the current situations. But for developed countries, it's very much possible because it's already developed. There is nothing to move forward. So even if something which we call as like zero emissions, that is not a sacrifice. It's kind of obligation or just a time pass because there is nothing to move forward because everything is done. So even there are like places in India, like large cities where there is no basic healthcare, all those things. So the kind of balance or progress, which somewhere those countries lost it, but the same time rich countries, they have it. So they could actually sacrifice or they could actually adjust their lifestyle at some point. So then actually it could help others. Yeah.
Isabel said thank you for that awesome response to the question. And in the chat, the last question that we have on here is from me. I was wondering what has been kind of the most important advancement or success you've seen in environmental justice in your work recently? Is there something that gives you hope and encourages you to keep fighting?
So the major progress that happened recently was the Save Our Rape protest that I have shown, because like people were hellbound to protect that forest, and there was even strikes at night, and so that actually worked, and the government moves back from that actually the project green light, and they gave a red light. So but the major success is that like the government is considering environmental justice movement as a major threat to their autocratic leadership. So you have seen like climate activists being arrested and kind of getting suppressed for the voices getting raised. That itself shows like the kind of there is injustice involved, and there is also when we try to portray or to show that injustice, the justice is being denied, and there is like deep hands involved in those injustice. Because like if I'm demanding justice, then actually if it's a clean process, they could actually deliver justice. But if there is a lot of dirty hands involved, dirty money involved, they could actually try to suppress the voice. So those suppression could actually bounce back with larger movements. So that's what happened in a lot of places, if we look back the history. So when it comes to environment movement, like I said, it's associated also with the livelihood of people, their culture, tradition, and the environment in which they live. So if we are protesting for climate movement, then it's for the society to prevent a societal collapse. But the kind of awareness we lack very much in India, because when we say about climate crisis, many people doesn't know about it. When we say climate change, many people say it's natural, and we have like very few people believing it's human caused, and the government is not ready to make people understand about that. So that's when it comes to developed countries, that's the privilege I was talking about. With education, the people already know about what climate crisis and they can act, and they could do anything. They could also show injustice in other countries as well, and should force government to block those agencies involved in injustice in other countries. So that's what happened with the incident of Bhopal gas tragedy. Because when we say like don't use DDT in US, it doesn't mean that you could use it in other countries. If we just say like don't use any chemicals in US, it doesn't mean you could use in other countries. So if US citizens demand like the polluting industries that banned in the US should not invest in countries that's in other countries, actually the government could do it because the company originates from the rich countries. So that's how we could actually see forward when it comes to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I will read out your comment, Isabel. I don't see any more questions, but Isabel put in the chat, Thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for joining us and listening in to John Paul. The recording will be available on YouTube shortly. Yes, thank you so much for your time today, John. This was great. I really learned so much.
Yeah.
And event attendees here did too. So if there's anything else we can do to help support you and your work, please let us know.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Isabel and Farid, and also Ashley, Colton, and Maya for joining. And it was a nice conversation. And thank you all for patiently listening to me. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was amazing.
Thanks, everyone.